It is the 9th hour on a Friday in April, somewhere around AD 33, and the sky above Jerusalem has been dark for 3 hours. Not overcast, not cloudy, dark. The kind of darkness that stops conversations, the kind that makes Roman soldiers, men trained to be afraid of nothing, go quiet and start glancing at each other. And in the middle of that darkness, a man hanging on a Roman cross opens his mouth and says something. One sentence in Aramaic, loud enough that the people standing at the foot of the cross can hear it clearly. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? Most people who read that line stop right there. They hear despair. They hear abandonment. They hear a man at the end of everything, asking the one question nobody wants to ask out loud. And they move on to the resurrection. But here is what most people miss, and what changes everything about that moment. Jesus was not just crying out in pain. He was quoting a poem, a specific poem, written by a specific man, in a specific crisis, roughly 1,000 years before that Friday, and in the world Jesus lived in. When a Jewish teacher quoted the first line of a psalm, the whole psalm was meant to echo in the mind of everyone who heard it. Every word of it. Which means if you want to understand what Jesus was saying on that cross, you cannot stop at verse 1. You have to read the whole thing, and most people never do. There are at least 10 moments inside Psalm 22 that most believers skip entirely. 10 verses that describe, with a precision that has no rational explanation, exactly what was happening to Jesus at the exact moment he spoke those words. Not prophecies that sort of fit if you squint. Specific details, medical details, details about clothing, details about bone structure and thirst, and the mockery of a crowd. Details that would have been impossible to engineer, impossible to fake, and impossible to explain unless the man who wrote them, a shepherd king sitting in a cave or on a throne 1,000 years before the Roman Empire existed, was somehow seeing what you and I would call the future. We are going to walk through those 10 moments together, and by the end, I think you will never read that cry from the cross the same way again. But first, who wrote this psalm, and why does it matter that Jesus chose this one? David wrote Psalm 22. The heading says so, and the voice inside the poem, hunted, surrounded, desperate but clinging, matches what we know of David's life. He knew what it felt like to be abandoned. He knew what it felt like to be surrounded by enemies who wanted him dead. He wrote from inside that experience, not from a comfortable distance. But here is a detail about ancient Hebrew poetry that most modern readers don't know, and it completely changes how you read this moment at the cross. In the 1st century, Jewish prayer and public worship operated by a system called incipit, the practice of identifying an entire text by its opening words. When a rabbi quoted the first line of a psalm in public, the audience didn't just hear one verse. They heard the whole psalm activated. It was shorthand. It was the ancient equivalent of playing the first 4 notes of a song everyone knows. The whole song starts playing in your head without you choosing it. Jesus grew up reciting the Psalms. Every Jewish boy did. The Psalms were not just hymns. They were the emotional vocabulary of an entire people. They were prayed at Passover, sung at weddings, whispered over the sick, shouted in the temple courts. Psalm 22 was not an obscure text. Every person standing at the foot of that cross who had been raised in a synagogue would have known what the rest of it said. So when Jesus opened his mouth in the 9th hour and said, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, he was not just uttering a cry of pain. He was pointing. He was saying, read the rest. Look at what is happening around you. Count the verses. This is the moment the whole poem has been waiting for. And if you do what he was asking, if you actually read the rest of Psalm 22, what you find there will stop you cold. Let's start at verse 6, because verse 6 is where most people who do keep reading tend to slow down and decide it's metaphorical. But I am a worm, not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. You have seen this scene. It is in all 4 Gospels. Matthew tells you the crowd passing by hurled insults at Jesus. They shook their heads. They said, he saved others, let him save himself. The religious leaders mocked him. The soldiers mocked him. Even one of the men crucified beside him, at least initially, joined in. A crowd standing below a cross, shaking their heads, hurling insults at a man dying above them. David wrote that sentence 1,000 years earlier, not as prediction, exactly, at least not in the way he understood it when he wrote it. He was writing about his own experience of humiliation. But the words he chose, the specific details he included, line up with the scene at Golgotha with a specificity that is very hard to explain as coincidence. Verse 8 adds another layer. He trusts in the Lord, let the Lord rescue him. Let God deliver him, since he delights in him. Matthew 27:43. Word for word, the chief priests and teachers of the law standing at the foot of the cross, saying exactly that. He trusts in God, let God rescue him now if he wants him. They were quoting Psalm 22 without knowing it. They were fulfilling a script they had never read. Stay with me. Verses 9 and 10 shift the emotional register entirely, and this is the part most people skip, because it doesn't fit the narrative of abandonment. Yet you brought me out of the womb. You made me trust in you, even at my mother's breast. From birth I was cast on you. From my mother's womb you have been my God. David is not losing his faith here. He is anchoring in it. Even in the worst moment of the poem, even in the place of total desolation, he is reaching back to the beginning of his life and saying, you have been here the whole time, since before I could speak, since before I could pray. And if Jesus is praying this psalm, the whole psalm, not just the first line, then this is also part of what he is saying. Not just abandonment, but a declaration of relationship that began before the cross and would survive it. That matters. We will come back to why. Verses 12 and 13 return to the darkness. Many bulls surround me, strong bulls of Bashan encircle me. Roaring lions that tear their prey open their mouths wide against me. The imagery is brutal, surrounded on all sides by powerful, predatory forces, no way out. And if you were standing at Golgotha on that fright, you would have recognized the picture. Roman soldiers in full armor, members of the Sanhedrin, a hostile crowd, a city in which every authority, religious and political, had already signed the death warrant. David wrote, surrounded by bulls and lions. Jesus was surrounded by the most powerful institutions of the ancient world. Now we come to verse 14, and here the psalm turns medical. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart has turned to wax, it has melted within me. Physicians who have studied crucifixion describe a specific physiological progression that occurs during this method of execution. The arms are extended, the weight of the body pulls on the shoulder joints. Over hours, the joints undergo severe strain, bones displaced from their normal articulation. Some physicians interpret, my heart has turned to wax, as a reference to pericardial effusion, the buildup of fluid around the heart that can accompany the physical trauma of crucifixion. David was a warrior. He understood physical suffering, but the specificity of verse 14, written roughly 1,000 years before Roman crucifixion, was even invented as a method of execution, is one of the most quietly remarkable details in the entire psalm. Verse 15, my mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You lay me in the dust of death. John 19:28. Later, knowing that everything had now been finished, and so that scripture would be fulfilled, Jesus said, I am thirsty. John specifically tells you that Jesus said those words so that the scripture would be fulfilled. He was pointing at Psalm 22. He was making sure, even in the final minutes, that anyone paying attention would connect the dots. One verse, one sentence in John, 15 centuries of connection. And we are not done. Verse 16 is where the argument starts. Dogs surround me, a pack of villains encircles me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. That last phrase is one of the most debated lines in the entire Old Testament. Not because the meaning is unclear in English. The meaning in English is perfectly clear. It is debated because of what happens when you go back to the Hebrew. The word translated pierced in most English Bibles is karu, or in some manuscripts kari. The Masoretic text, the standardized Hebrew text that most modern translations are based on, reads the word as kari, which means like a lion. But other manuscripts read it as karu, which means they dug, or they pierced, the difference of a single letter. Critics of the Messianic interpretations say the verse should read, like a lion, my hands and my feet, which is grammatically awkward and, to many scholars, less coherent. Defenders of the traditional reading point to the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures made, roughly 200 years before Jesus was born, which translates the word as oroxen. They dug, they pierced. Justin Martyr, writing around AD 160, in his dialogue with Triff, quotes this exact verse in a debate with a Jewish scholar and argues that the Messianic reading is the correct one. The argument has been going on for nearly 2,000 years. And here is what makes it remarkable regardless of which side you land on. A Hebrew poem from roughly 1000 BC contains a phrase about hands and feet in the context of a man surrounded by enemies, who is suffering to the point of death, and a Jewish man in the 1st century AD quoted the opening line of that same poem while hanging on a cross with nails through his hands and feet. The argument about one letter does not erase the weight of that. If anything, the fact that the debate is so fierce, that so much effort has gone into disputing that one word for 2,000 years, tells you how much is at stake in the answer. Pay attention to this. Verse 17. I can count all my bones. People stare and gloat over me. Crucifixion was a public spectacle by Roman design. Victims were placed along main roads, and at city gates specifically so that passers-by would see them. It was deterrence, a political message written in human suffering, and the posture of a crucified man, arms extended, body sagging, ribcage exposed, meant that the bones of the chest became visible through the skin. Josephus, the Jewish historian writing in the 1st century, describes Roman punishment practices in Judea in terms that confirm just how exposed the body became. I can count all my bones. People stare. Verse 18. This is the one that removes all ambiguity. They divide my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing. John 19, verses 23 and 24. When the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes, dividing them into 4 shares, one for each of them, with the undergarment remaining. This garment was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. Let's not tear it, they said to one another. Let's decide by lot who will get it. This happened so that the scripture would be fulfilled that said, they divided my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing. John is not suggesting a loose thematic parallel. He is quoting Psalm 22:18 directly. 4 soldiers, 1 seamless garment, 1 casting of lots, 1 verse, fulfilled in real time, while the man who had quoted the opening line of the same psalm hung dying above them. There is a practice in Hebrew scholarship called pesher, an interpretive move that says, this ancient text is being fulfilled in this present moment. Jesus was doing pesher from the cross, not with a scroll in his hand, with his life. Now we reach the part of Psalm 22 that almost nobody ever talks about, because the psalm does not end at verse 18. It keeps going, and what happens next is not a continuation of suffering. It is something else entirely. Verse 22. I will declare your name to my brothers and sisters. In the assembly, I will praise you. The tone has shifted completely. First person future tense, I will declare, I will praise. This is not the language of a man who believes he has been permanently abandoned. This is the language of a man who believes he is coming out the other side. And here is what makes verse 22 remarkable beyond the tone shift. It is quoted in the New Testament, Hebrews chapter 2, verse 12. The writer of Hebrews, arguing that Jesus is not ashamed to call human beings his brothers and sisters, quotes this exact line from Psalm 22 and attributes it to Jesus. The author of Hebrews understood that Psalm 22 was not just a prophecy of the crucifixion. It was a prophecy of what came after. The declaration, the assembly, the praise from inside a community of people who had been rescued. The resurrection is embedded in the psalm. It was there the whole time. Verse 24 is the one that, in my view, changes the entire emotional landscape of what Jesus was doing on that cross. For he has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. Read that again slowly. The God who seemed, in verse 1, to have forsaken the suffering man, by verse 24, the psalm itself answers that question. He did not turn away. He did not despise the suffering. He was listening the whole time. This is not a contradiction in the psalm. This is the structure of the psalm. The opening cry, why have you forsaken me, is not the final word. The opening cry is the honest beginning of a prayer that moves, over 22 verses of raw honesty, toward a conclusion the speaker could not see at the start. And Jesus, hanging on that cross, quoting the opening line, knew where the poem ended. He had memorized it. He had prayed it. He knew that verse 1 leads to verse 24. He knew that, my God, why have you forsaken me, leads to he has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry. He was not announcing that God had abandoned him. He was announcing that the whole psalm, including the part about God not abandoning him, was being fulfilled. Right now, in this moment, in this darkness, in these hours that felt like the end of everything. He was saying, stay with the poem, read to the end. But it gets stranger, because the ending of Psalm 22 is not just personal. It is not just about one man being rescued from one crisis. The final verses go somewhere that should stop every reader cold. Before we get there, one thing needs to be said clearly. The cry from the cross was not weakness. Jewish lament is not the same as despair. The lament psalms, and there are dozens of them, follow a specific literary structure. Honest expression of suffering, followed by memory of God's past faithfulness, followed by a turn toward trust. Psalm 22 follows that structure exactly. The whole form of the poem is an argument against permanent abandonment, even when it begins with the question of abandonment. Jesus knew what he was quoting. He was the rabbi who said the whole law hung on 2 commandments. He was the man who, in the synagogue at Nazareth, rolled the scroll to a specific passage and told the room, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." He did not quote scripture carelessly or accidentally. He quoted Psalm 22 because Psalm 22 was the text for that moment. All of it, including the ending. Verses 27 through 31. This is where the psalm explodes outward. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will bow down before him. David wrote that, a shepherd king whose political world extended from the Nile to the Euphrates, who ruled a nation roughly the size of New Jersey. This man wrote a poem in which the suffering figure at the center becomes the reason that every nation on earth turns to the God of Israel. Not just Israel, not just the covenant people, not a tribal religion contained within one set of borders. All the ends of the earth, all the families of the nations. This is a vision of universal worship that breaks through every geographic and ethnic boundary of David's world, and lands somewhere that sounds, to modern ears, exactly like the Great Commission. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations. Matthew 28:19. The same universality, the same boundary-crossing vision, the same movement from the death of one man to the worship of all people. David didn't just write about a suffering individual. He wrote about an individual whose suffering would become the hinge point of human history. Verse 29 adds another layer. All who go down to the dust will kneel before him, those who cannot keep themselves alive. Not the strong, not the self-sufficient, not the ones who have their lives under control. The ones who cannot keep themselves alive are the ones who kneel, the ones who have come to the end of their own resources, the ones who have arrived at the dust and found that there is nothing left to try. If you have ever been that person, and most of us have, at some point, been that person, then this verse was written for you, 1,000 years before you were born. A king who had been that person too wrote you into the ending of his poem. And then verse 31, the final line of Psalm 22. They will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to a people not yet born that he has done it. A people not yet born. David was writing about you, about people who would read his words thousands of years after he died, about generations that did not exist yet, in nations that did not exist yet, speaking languages that had not been invented yet. He has done it. That is the ending of the psalm, not the suffering, not the darkness at noon or the soldiers or the lots. He has done it. And when Jesus, from the cross, said, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," he was pulling that whole poem into that moment. He was telling anyone with ears to hear, read to the end. Because the end is not despair. The end is a declaration, made to people not yet born, that it is finished. John 19:30, the last word Jesus speaks before he dies. It is finished. In Greek, tetelestai, a word used in the ancient world to stamp a debt certificate when the full payment had been made. Not abandoned, not defeated, completed. The same declaration that ends Psalm 22, in different words, 1,000 years later. He has done it. If this video has been useful to you, subscribing means you will not miss the next time we go this deep into a text most people have only skimmed. Now, 3 things I want you to take with you. First, the Bible is not a collection of disconnected stories. It is one long conversation, written by dozens of people over thousands of, and somehow coherent. Psalm 22 and the Gospel of John are separated by roughly 1,000 years, and written in different languages by people who never met, and they describe the same scene in the same specific detail. That is not an accident of history. That is not a coincidence. That is not a loose parallel. That is a design, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Second, the cry from the cross was not the end of the sentence. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani is the first line of a prayer that moves through suffering toward trust, through death toward declaration, through abandonment toward he has not hidden his face. Jesus on the cross was not a man losing his faith. He was a man in the most honest possible conversation with his Father, using the most honest possible words the Hebrew tradition had ever produced for that kind of moment. Lament is not faithlessness. Lament is the kind of prayer that trusts God enough to say the true thing out loud. Third, and this is the one I want you to sit with, Psalm 22 ends with the words He has done it, addressed to a people not yet born. You are that people. You were written into the ending of this psalm before your language existed, before your country existed, before your name was known to anyone. The man on that cross, quoting those opening words, was pulling the whole arc of the poem into that moment, including the part where the people not yet born find out that it is finished, that the debt has been stamped, that the darkness at noon was not the end of the story. It never was. David sat somewhere, maybe a hillside, maybe a throne room, maybe a cave with enemies camped outside, and he wrote a poem about suffering so specific that it would describe a scene 1,000 years in the future. He wrote about mocking crowds and pierced hands and divided garments, and a tongue too dry to move. He wrote about bones pulled out of joint and a heart turning to wax. He wrote about a man surrounded by the most powerful forces of his world with nowhere to go and no one coming. And then, because David had lived long enough to know that the darkness is not permanent, he wrote about the turn, the declaration, the nations, the people not yet born. Jesus read that poem and recognized himself in it. Not just the suffering, the whole arc. He quoted the first line so that everyone listening would follow the arc to the end. He has done it. If you have never read all 31 verses of Psalm 22 in one sitting, do it today. Read it slowly. Read it knowing what you now know about what was happening on that Friday in April. And watch what happens when you get to the ending. Because David wrote that ending for you.